Have you ever wondered why Mr. Tolkien created multiple Elvish languages within the story of The Lord of the Rings? Like, aren't elves supposed to be just one race, right? So why are there multiple Elvish languages? Well, let's see. As you might know already, Professor Tolkien treated languages like an art form. They were his hobby, and the stories actually started with him making languages. And he treated each language that he learned and then later created as a separate flavor, like wine. So you might have heard of the two most popular Elvish languages, Sindarin and Quenya, but there are others. But if you want to learn either of these two most popular ones, I got courses on both. You can check them out with the first link in the description. So in order to understand why there are multiple Elvish languages within the Legendarium, we have to understand the concepts of external history and internal history. So the external history of the Legendarium, the universe of The Lord of the Rings, is Mr. Tolkien's writing process. The real world history that led to the creation of the Legendarium and all the books inside it, and all the lore as well. So Professor Tolkien's passion for languages would be part of this external history. And also the fact that he was influenced in his creation of languages by real languages, real world languages like Finnish, Latin, stuff like that. But what matters here is the internal history. So basically, imagine that, Professor Tolkien loved creating languages and he wanted to make multiple, right, for his stories. But not just for different races, but also for the same race, right? For elves, he wanted to make many different Elvish languages inspired by different real languages. So how do you do that, right? For that, we have to take a look at the internal history of the Legendarium, and especially of the Elvish race as a whole. So yeah, imagine you start creating your new fantasy world by creating different languages. Then you have to put them into the story. So you can sort of reverse engineer the story, the lore of this fictional universe to fit those languages. So basically, Professor Tolkien wouldn't be able to fit multiple Elvish languages within a single story if he hadn't explained how they fit together within the history of the Elvish race, within the story of The Lord of the Rings. So let's explore this internal history, this Elvish lore, the history of the Elvish race within the Legendarium, just a little bit. So yeah, actually, when the Elvish race sort of started, we say that elves awoke by the lake of Quenya. Yeah, they actually kind of started speaking just one language. So yeah, imagine the story of the elves just started and it's just one tribe of elves, right? They awoke by this lake and they just speak one language that now we can call primitive Elvish. And basically from then on, right, elves started splitting into different tribes throughout some events within the story of the Legendarium that Mr. Tolkien started describing in his writings, his books, and also like letters, for example. And that's how just different Elvish languages evolved, because elves started splitting into different groups. Some major events that split this original tribe of elves into smaller subgroups were, for example, something called the Great Journey. So from this beginning, this lake of Quenya, elves wanted to migrate to this blessed realm of Aman, but not all elves. So some elves just stayed by the lake, some elves stopped in the middle of the journey, some elves, finished the journey, and that's how different groups started forming. Another big event was what we call now the Rebellion of Noldor, after which the Noldor elves went into exile, basically. Elvish languages were also very much influenced by the story of Numenor, which basically span across the whole Second Age, and ends with the fall of the city, and how Elvish languages were preserved, especially within the Third Age and forward, is also very much influenced by the story of Numenor. And in general, just elves within the story of the Legendarium started splitting into different subgroups, staying at different places, sometimes for a little bit, sometimes for a long time, like for example in Beleriand, right? And that's how those different tribes of elves started, and the language that they spoke among themselves started evolving and started differentiating from other ones. But because they all started at the same place, basically, we can trace a lot of words in different, Elvish languages to the same primitive Elvish root words. So that's how those languages correlate, coexist together. So let's go through the most important Elvish languages from the whole Legendarium and see how they differ a little bit and how they came to be, so we understand it better. The first one, the one that people say is the most advanced, is called Quenya. You might know about it already. And actually, it's the most similar to this original primitive Elvish language in terms of, grammar rules, the sound of this language, etc. Now, within the external history of this language, so how Mr. Tolkien created it, the first versions of it were actually called Quenya, without the U. And coming back to the internal history, so how this language evolved within the story of the Legendarium, the Lord of the Rings, is that the Valar gods, the gods of Tolkien's Legendarium, actually started liking this language very much, and that's why Quenya is also influenced a little bit by their, the Valar gods' original language, Valarin. So that's quite crazy as well. Also, there are some dwarvish influences in Quenya. For example, the word Khazar, which means dwarf, comes from the dwarvish Khazad, or at least they're similar, Quenya was also the first language that was recorded in writing, but not in Tengwar, the most popular Elvish writing system that we have now, but actually in a very primitive writing system called the Rumil system, the system of Rumil, so created by an elf called Rumil. And in general, Quenya was the language of the Noldor, Noldorin elves, and they were also referred to as the High Elves. They were like scholars, stuff like that, and they mastered Sindarin, and actually that's how Sindarin became so popular within the story of the Lord of the Rings, because the Noldor elves that spoke Quenya also mastered Sindarin very quickly, but the Sindar elves, took some time when it comes to learning Quenya and never really mastered it, they just knew a little bit of it. And that's why Sindarin became so popular, because everybody started speaking it. And Quenya became this sort of language of the books, as it's called, Elvish, Latin. And as we've already covered, there's also Sindarin, so the language that, for example, Legolas speaks, right? And this was the language of the Sindar elves, so also called Grey elves. And these were the elves that remained in Middle-earth after the First Age. This language differs the most from this original primitive Elvish language. It has different mutations, consonant mutations, some weird grammar rules, sometimes a lot more just letters, characters than Quenya, stuff like that. And Sindarin actually stems from another Elvish language, a primitive version of a language called Telerin. So let's cover that a little bit right now. So just quickly, Telerin, although it's not like fully developed within the external history, right? It was the language of the Teleri elves. They were also called the Sea elves. And it's mentioned very little, we have only these archaic forms. We have just a few mentions of it. But yeah, Sindarin stems from its sort of primitive version. There's actually a nice drawing that shows the journey, the evolution of Elvish languages that I will show you on the screen right now. And there are also some other Elvish languages that are mentioned even less than Telerin, like Silvan, the language of the Silvan elves as well. It also is related to Sindarin. It's sort of the language of the wood elves, as they're called. There's also Avarin, the language of the Avari elves, that also refused to go on this great journey, and different versions of Quenya that were used by different types of elves. Evolution of Quenya is very, very complex. But yeah, there were also different versions of Quenya, even something called Ngoldorin. The evolution within the external history is also very complicated, so we might cover that in another video. So yeah, that's basically it. That's how different Elvish languages came to be within this one story of the Legendarium. Basically, Mr. Tolkien treated languages like a hobby, right? Loved them, loved creating them from a very young age, and wanted to fit as many as possible, basically, in his stories. So he reverse engineered the story of the Elvish race to include a few Elvish languages within, this one story at the same time, right? Although, yeah, they started with just one language. The whole tribe of elves awoke in Middle-earth and spoke what we call now primitive Elvish. And then different tribes of elves started popping out, started separating, and that's how different languages started as well. And within the Third Age of the Legendarium, so the story of actually the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, Sindarin and Quenya are the most popular, and that's why they also have the most words created by Mr. Tolkien, and that's why they're also the most popular, like in real life, within the Tolkien language community, because they're actually being spoken, they're the most popular at the time when the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit are taking place. So that's it. If you were confused by that, how are there, so many languages, Elvish languages, within one story, one tribe of elves within the Lord of the Rings? That's how this basically happened. That's the history of it. Again, remember, if you want to learn the two most popular Elvish languages, check out my full Elvish courses in the description. And either way, I'll see you another time, another day. Namarie.